Advent theme is close to home, and on this first Sunday of Advent, we explore that theme of making a home for all. And we have read this story from Luke to draw from to get our message for today. And he begins with this setting the stage, letting people know about a point in history, and also telling us something about the political situation that is happening there. So it's interesting, there are people in the world who say you should leave politics out of church, but I don't know how you can read about Pontius Pilate and, well, I'll tell you about them here, and then you'll see there's political stuff that's going on here. So the whole first 5 or 6 lines of this chapter in Luke 3 tells us all about who the rulers are. The reign of Emperor Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, Herod, the ruler of Galilee and his bro Philip, the ruler of Iturea and Trachonitis and Lysanias of Abilene, high priesthood Annas and Caiaphas. After all that political setup, we hear the word of the Lord that came to John the Baptist out in the wilderness. Normally, we ignore that whole thing, the whole thing about the first 6 lines and all of the rulers. We just struggle through the pronunciations like I just did and move on. But the words are there for a reason. They're trying to tell us something. Tiberius was an emperor known for his cruelty and severity. Pontius Pilate was also brutal and enacted brutal massacres of Jewish people in Judea, and was just insensitive to Jews who were living under his rule. The rulers of the family of Herod the Great, Philip and Herod and Lysanias, were known for their corruption and cruelty. And they're sort of like out in the back reaches of this Rome. Can you, let's see, Debbie, can you, yeah. So you can see sort of there where you've got Galilee up there at the top. These are some of the places that are being talked about there. It's a political map that shows something about who was ruling. And then the Jordan River that also gets mentioned in here goes from that body of water down to, at the top, down to that other body of water. And that's where John was hanging out. So going in and out of different areas that are ruled by a specific person and yelling in the way that he was yelling. So with all this, Luke reminds both his original readers and us of the corruption and moral degradation of the Roman Empire, especially in these distant provinces of Judea. Judea is the one that's down at the bottom, right? And those rulers in those places are not just mentioned in the Bible. These are people who, like, you can find in historical texts that were part of the Roman Empire. So given all that political lay of the land, we now have John the Baptist who comes onto the scene. John, who is not Jesus, but understands himself to be the one who will be preparing the way for Jesus, or preparing the way for the Messiah, the one who would come to save us. He comes in from the wilderness. In other words, he's sort of an off-the-grid guy. He, as you know from other texts, from other Gospels, is said to eat wild honey and locusts. And you've seen pictures of him, like, wearing his, like, camel coat and whatever. Like, he's not participating in the economics of this land. So he's, like, living in that sort of outlaw sort of way outside of whatever is happening among society. And then for some reason he gets this message from God and decides he has to come walk the Jordan and start yelling at everybody in exhortations. He comes in as one who says he's been called to do what he does, and then he quotes to them from their scriptures, which include the book of Isaiah, this book that was written, at least this part of it, to a group of people who were living in exile, who had been removed from their homeland and wondering if they would ever get to go back, and knowing that the way was far and the obstacles were many. To them, Isaiah spoke these words of comfort and promise that every valley will be lifted up and every mountain will be flattened and the rough places will be made smooth and the crooked paths will be made straight. They're talking about a way through the wilderness to get back to your home. As it is written in the book of the words of the prophet Isaiah, he says, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked paths made straight, and the rough ways made smooth. And all flesh shall see the salvation of God. John the Baptist, speaking in this land occupied by Rome, speaks these same words of comfort then when he comes out of the desert. He's talking about making a way for Jesus, but the end result isn't anything that's easy for Jesus. It's leveling the playing field, flattening valleys and mountains so that all flesh can see the glory of God. So it's for everyone else. It's leveling the playing field for everyone else so that everyone has access to God. So who is he preaching to? Our text ends by saying that he walked up and down this valley with exhortations, so that's yelling at people. And the people heard these exhortations, and it was good news to them. So what's it sound like if it's good news? You brood of vipers! And then he accuses them of various things, right? He's walking up and down this Jordan River through all these lands, and people who are rulers and soldiers and tax collectors are hearing him, and people who are living in occupied land as occupied people are hearing him. I'm guessing it didn't sound like good news to everyone. But the story tells us that the people were filled with expectation when they heard him. So we've got exhortation and expectation. You can imagine this feeling, right? Sometime in your life you've had it when there's some unjust thing that is happening and no one has the guts to do anything about it, and then all of a sudden somebody decides to start something and make something happen, and it looks like something might change. And inside you're going, yeah! That's what the people were feeling as they heard John the Baptist. That's what felt like the good news to the occupied lands in the Holy Roman Empire. So what was he so mad about? He has some specific assignments for people. The first one is to people in general, who the first ones who said, what should we do? And he says to them, whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise. And then the tax collectors wonder what they should do, and he says, collect no more than the prescribed amount, because you know that happened in that Holy Roman Empire. There was just massive, corruption, skimming. Good words, yeah, like at making people pay more, extorting more taxes than they were supposed to. And then the soldiers ask what they should do. And it's not, their assignment says, do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusations, and be satisfied with your wages. You can see what he's preaching against here is all economic. All 3 of those things are related to economics. He is pissed off that there are people who are living in poverty, people living with less, people having obstacles put in the way of liberation because of unfair taxation, extortion, and people just taking too much for themselves and not sharing. I want to tell you about a game that I used to play with people when I was working, especially with college students. I can't quite remember what the game is called, but it's like the Agents of Change or something like that. And I would stand with a group of students and I would tell them, I want you to close your eyes and squat down. So everybody does this. I can't even squat anymore. And then I would say, if you're tapped once, you can stand up. If you're tapped twice, you can stand up and open your eyes. If you're tapped 3 times, you can do whatever you want. And what do you think happened? Well, first people start moaning and complaining, right? Like, I have bad knees. And when I would hear that, I would say, if you tapped once, you can stand up. If you tap twice, you can stand up and open your eyes. If you tap 3 times, you can do whatever you want. And I would hear, this is dumb. And I would say, if you tapped once, you can stand up. If you tap twice, you can stand up and open your eyes. If you tap 3 times, you can do whatever you want. And then I would start tapping people. And most people then would stand up, and then sometimes they'd open their eyes. About the time when you start telling people they can open their eyes, then they start looking around to see who else has their eyes open. And then at some point, especially when you get to tapping a person 3 times, usually the first person who gets tapped 3 times goes and sits down. Usually the second person does the same thing. And sometime around the 3rd person, they break out and just start tapping everybody, and then the game's over immediately. One time, I played this game with a group of students that not students, I shouldn't call them that because some of them weren't, a group of boys who were involved in the juvenile justice system in Chicago. And we were on a retreat. I have more stories about that. We'll save them for another day. I'll try not to use the language they used when they played this game. So I think it happened within 15 seconds that one kid was like, "This is bull, I'll tap you," and just started reaching out from wherever he could to tap people from down below. And the game was over in 15 seconds flat. So, super well-meaning, well-educated, white liberal college students, this game goes on forever because they like to follow the rules. But you put it in the hands of kids who are like involved in the juvenile justice system, and it's a different story. They figure out how to break the rules that should be broken. This means at first they were able to be creative about getting around those rules and not conforming to them or just listening to everything that I was saying as this corrupt ruler who wouldn't listen to people. It means they had a desire to free other people even if they were not free themselves. And it means that it meant that they were concerned about a whole group and not just them. John the Baptist is somewhere in that story, who was not afraid to say things that people thought couldn't be said, who didn't conform to the rules and tried to free other people. Now, in this room, the vast majority of us lie in all kinds of places of what we might call the power wheel or the privilege wheel. Hopefully that's readable. And this might be a little bit different. It's been worked on, adopted a little bit since I first learned about it. But you can see that there's power that's in the middle of this circle. And then there are all kinds of things on the outside of that circle. So the first circle that you see, you will find are the characteristics of a person or the things that we have, whether they're characteristics or not, that give you power. And the closer you are, the more you have of those, the closer you are to power. But then it's sort of on a spectrum, so that your second section there is farther away from power, but not yet in that marginalized place, more marginalized than before. And then the outer ring is the place where people are marginalized the most, and it's all related to things like language and gender and citizenship and skin color and formal education and ability and disability, sexuality, neurodiversity, mental health, body size, housing, wealth. One that's not up there, that is probably not up there because it's complicated, is age. Complicated because in some places, if you're old, you have some power. We just elected, for instance, you don't elect people who are 30. Apparently you elect people who are 79. But then also, we know that people who are young have power that people who are old don't. So it goes both ways, which is why I think they didn't include it here. Or it goes every way, I should say. There's no both anymore. They should just get rid of the word both in our vocabulary. So the places of power include being male and white and cisgendered and able-bodied and straight and neurotypical and slim and mentally stable and educated and a citizen who speaks English as a first language, rich, property owners. The closer you are to those things, the more privilege you have in this society. Most of us will find ourselves on that list somewhere. In those places, this text offers you a challenge to share the privilege that you have in whatever ways you can, to step back from power to make room for others, to share your resources and use your voice for others when they can't, or at best, to use your voice to amplify or make space for the voices of others. For those places, you should heed the words of John the Baptist to level the playing fields where we can, the mountains and valleys and the crooked paths. But most of us also find ourselves in other places on that wheel, not in the center of power, either marginalized or on a spectrum between marginalization and power. And where we don't have privilege, that's where John's massive exhortations that he keeps saying were the good news people needed to hear. They were thrilled that someone was finally demanding justice for them. That's why it was good news when he started yelling out to people, "You brood of vipers." But, ever heard of Oppression Olympics? Because that's when people play games with this power wheel, when they're trying to pretend that they have it the worst, or maybe not pretend, but imagine that they have it the worst because they are of a certain marginalized place. So don't talk to them because they are not the problem, because they are whatever. They lack power because of fill in the blank. So they can't be racist because they're gay, or what about that? Why aren't we talking about how hard it is to be gay instead of talking about being racist as an example? Or don't talk to me about racism because I want to talk about how hard it is to be poor. This happens, you see this happen with white women and black men all the time. Power struggles between those two groups about who has it worse. So if you find yourself looking at this power wheel and trying to find all the places where you're the marginalized one, then you're over-identifying with being a victim. And that means that allows you to get out of that hard work that you have to do in those places. And denying that you have power and privilege in certain areas is also an abuse of power. Because if you're denying that you have it, but we are experiencing that you do have it and you just won't claim it and won't do anything about it, well then, I guess what I'm saying is that you'll find yourself in all kinds of places in this wheel of power and privilege, and it's best if you can be real about it, where you are, so that when you find yourself with privilege, you can find ways to use it well. And so that you can just recognize that you don't have power and then figure out how to claim some of your own power anyway. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. That's why this sermon is so long. In the end of this section of the Bible that we read about, there's more confusing stuff. You've got the winnowing fork and the hand to clear the threshing floor, to gather the wheat into the granary, but the chaff will be burned in the unquenchable fire. All that sounds very scary and weird. But let me talk to you about what those tools are, or what that tool is. The winnowing fork is used to toss grain into the air so that the lighter stuff, the chaff, blows away. And the grain, the stuff that has value, falls to the floor so that it can be collected up and used. And so that means, I think, that each of us, as grains of wheat, has those things that must be shed. And those places where we sin or misuse power or fail to recognize our privilege or ignore that there are others in pain or just sit by watching it happen because that's how the rules work. So I'm just going to go sit off to the side. And also to recognize that sometimes you may think that you don't have any power and privilege, but sometimes you just have to take it. I was just in New York, some of you know, and I went to see the musical Suffs, which is about the suffragist movement that was working on the fight for the right for women to vote, among other things. One of the things it does a great job of is talking about the complications of the factions within the suffragist movement. The older white women whose tactic was like bake Woodrow Wilson cookies and try to have tea with him and say, let mother vote is their line. Their like campaign, like we raised you, so you should trust us with a vote. And then the young women come in and they're like, it's not working, we need to march. And the old women are like, no, we don't want to put that on Woodrow Wilson's plate because he's got this whole war to deal with. And the women are like, no, we need to march. And so you can go home and listen to the young are at the gate because they make this march happen. And this is the forerunner to the march that happened in 2016, which will also happen this year, January 18th, 2025. Then there's also the Southern women who weren't going to participate or help fund the effort if black people were marching too. And the black women who also wanted lynching to be a part of the platform that was talked about on this march, because they can't vote if they're hanging from trees. That's a line right from the play. I'm not trying to be crass. And they certainly did not want to be marching in the back, which was sort of the compromise that they tried to come up with. The black women in this play then sing this great song that talks about how when we show up for all of us, and lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go. Like that kid down on the floor tapping everybody around him. And the future demands that we fight for it now. I also went to Stonewall when I was in New York. Stonewall was a gay bar in Greenwich Village where in June of 1969, police showed up and started beating customers and servers and bartenders. And an uprising happened that lasted like 6 days. Actually, just the word uprising tells you something, right? Like, think about that game that I was talking about, game of people squatting on the floor in pain with their eyes closed who needed to rise up. So the people rose up to demand the freedom and the safety and a place to call home that they were not receiving because of the brutality of the police against them. That fight was for a safe place to call home. John the Baptist's good news sounds harsh with his vipers and winnowing forks and threshing floors, but it only sounds harsh if you're the oppressor. And also, you are, in various ways. And also, you aren't, in various ways. He preaches a home for all, where inequities are banished, valleys are lifted up, and all have the resources that they need for collective flourishing. The path towards creating a safe home for all requires some deconstruction, and that's going to take the work of all of us in various places where we find ourselves on this wheel. Some of our structures are rotting, and some of our institutions are compromised, and some of our rituals need repair, and nothing is beyond redemption. That's the promise of Christ, who is always coming into the world, who is always close to home.